Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. 75 years ago, the nation suffered what had been, prior to 9/11, the worst attack on its shores. Not surprisingly, the events surrounding that attack on Pearl Harbor have been, for 75 years, the subject of almost endless debate, speculation, and blame. While understanding history is never perfect, the rearview mirror is not always clear. But in their new book on the events surrounding Pearl Harbor, historian and journalists Anthony Summers and Robbyn Swan come as close as possible. Anthony Summers is the author of 9 previous books, including The 11th Day, which was a finalist for the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for History. Summers has traveled worldwide for the BBC. He was deputy editor of their flagship program, Panorama, and his books have been the basis for major television documentaries. Robbyn Swan is the author of 4 previous books with Anthony Summers. She worked as a researcher for John le Carré and has written for Salon, National Journal, The Daily Telegraph, and has contributed to documentaries for PBS and the History Channel. It is my pleasure to welcome Anthony Summers and Robbyn Swan to talk about a matter of honor, Pearl Harbor, betrayal, blame, and a family's quest for justice. Anthony Summers, Robbyn Swan, thanks so much for joining us on Radio Who, What, Why.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anthony, I want to start with you. Your last book focused on the events surrounding 9/11. Talk a little bit about the nexus between 9/11 and the work you did looking back on what happened at Pearl Harbor.
We have covered both 9/11 and Pearl Harbor because there are likenesses. Great events like that arrive with an enormous noise, news noise, and within administrations, counterclaim and claim, and they go from the very beginning. What really happened is fuzzy at the edges, unclear, and then an artificial clarity is created. And the key one we found in this case is that blame was placed on the commanders in Hawaii, the U.S. commanders and chief in Hawaii, early on, and this was not fair. They needed a scapegoat. What one Navy administrator described years later as unnecessary scapegoat, and a lot of the focus of our work over the last year or so has been trying to determine to what extent it was fair or not fair to blame the commanders on the spot.
When one looks at that, and the focus that was placed on Admiral Kimmel, who was, as you say, the scapegoat and who took the bulk of the blame for the events, was it because there was an effort to find a scapegoat or because the immediacy of events at the time pointed in that direction?
Well, as you say, I think it was partially the immediacy issue. Right after the attack, there was a lot of finger-pointing, but there was also a need to bring the country together and to move on. And the commission that was hastily formed by President Roosevelt, who was himself under attack for getting the U.S., quote-unquote, into a war that he had promised not to get into, made Kimmel and Short out there in Hawaii, and as the military commanders on the scene, the natural place to staunch the flow of blood from the top. We need to get this investigation finished, and then we need to move forward as a country, and we need to keep the commanders in place. We cannot sacrifice Kimmel and Short, but also sacrifice our Chief of Naval Operations, our Chief of Staff, and other senior ranking officers. So we must stop here. We must get on with the war effort.
Talk a little bit, Anthony, about where Roosevelt was looking to place blame.
I think Roosevelt, I don't think Roosevelt sat in the White House and said blame Naval Commander Admiral Kimmel and Army Commander in Hawaii General Short. It wasn't like that, but he did appoint a presidential commission and sent them to Hawaii to find out what happened. Well, from the start, that was an unbalanced way to go about it, because all the answers were not in Hawaii. Many of the answers were, in fact, in Washington, where there had been what we determined over the last couple of years of delving into tens of thousands of records there had been gross inefficiencies at naval headquarters in Washington. I don't think he gave a brief at all to go and find Kimmel and Short totally to blame for the problem, but his order was to go and find out who was to blame, and the commission went to Hawaii and did most of its investigating in Hawaii, and surprise, surprise, the blame was placed in Hawaii.
As a small example, Jeff, the witness testimony, so to speak, that was collected in Washington was done in sort of an ever-so-chummy fashion, not under oath, by and large, groups of men meeting with the commission, sort of hashing out what they had done. In Hawaii, by contrast, men were brought in one at a time in a very adversarial courtroom-like situation without representation and grilled over their behavior under oath. So two completely different setups. Gives you an idea of the different tone and the different direction the evidence gathering took in each of those places.
And officers have rights at a court-martial. This was not a court-martial. No charges were laid as such, but they were used to the idea that they would have their rights in the same way that a civilian would have rights in a civilian court in the United States. But they weren't allowed to have an attorney or a fellow officer representing them. And indeed, Admiral Kimmel, who was not a man subject to hysteria, he was a very level-headed naval officer, came out at one point and said to somebody in the anteroom to the hearing in Hawaii, "What are they trying to do, crucify me?" That was the atmosphere.
There were numerous reports that were done, numerous commissions that were set up over time to look into this. Talk about that.
Well, Admiral Kimmel really pushed for court-martial. So did General Short while he lived. They wanted the chance to clear their names. On the other side of that, we had the fact that Roosevelt's enemies kept using the Pearl Harbor issue repeatedly as a political blunt instrument to get at him, that he himself was personally responsible in some way for the severity of the attack. So they were pushing for further investigation. These two elements marching forward through the 1940s meant that there was a real push for investigation. At the same time, there were secrets being kept, secrets that would have affected the war effort had they come out. So there was this constant tension between the two, when and where it would be appropriate to have an investigation, what could be said, how much could be made public. In the end, there were 9 official inquiries. After the initial investigation by the Roberts Commission that made those terrible charges against Kimmel and Short, there were subsequently Navy and Army courts of inquiry. The Navy Court of Inquiry, a panel of 3 admirals, found that Admiral Kimmel had behaved responsibly throughout, that there had been no dereliction on his part. Unfortunately, that was kept secret. Later, there were some opinions, some endorsements added to that by the Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations that were very harsh and took a very harsh tone towards Kimmel, and that was eventually publicly released. And then later after that, there was a very large congressional inquiry, a joint congressional inquiry with both House and Senate participation in 1945 and going into 1946. And that gave Kimmel the opportunity to speak publicly and air much of the case he could make, that he had not been properly informed of various key issues, and make his case for the defense. But by then, his reputation had been so tarnished, it was not really possible to clear himself, to clear his name.
Talk a little bit about the attitude in Washington, as there were, from time to time, fingers that were pointed directly at Roosevelt.
Roosevelt was, if not keen, he was interested and in favor of joining in the war against the Nazis. He wanted, on the other hand, to fend off war in the Pacific. He didn't want to be fighting on 2 fronts at once, so that his natural position was to support basically the British against the Nazis in the Atlantic during the Atlantic War, and to hope that war would not break out anytime soon in the Pacific. The people and a large body of the Congress in Washington were absolutely against the war. They were called the isolationists. And when Pearl Harbor happened, and immediately, as the obvious reaction, war had to be declared against Japan, and within a couple of days, we were at war with Germany as well. There were accusations that started, rumors started, that built up and have lasted down the years, so they've become not the fact, but a sort of accepted public rumor that Roosevelt had known in advance, had some foreknowledge, possibly shared with Winston Churchill, that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. But because Roosevelt wanted to get into the war, so went the rumor, he had allowed the attack to go ahead. We have really dug deep into those accusations and have found them completely baseless.
Talk a little bit about the Chief of Naval Operations, Harold Starr, and his role in all of this.
Well, Harold Starr had been one of Admiral Kimmel's closest friends in the Navy. And when Kimmel was appointed, Stark wrote to him and told him how happy he was that he was going to have someone with Kimmel's can-do attitude in the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific and the nominal head of the entire fleet. But Stark had some flaws as an administrator. He was, by all accounts, a very diplomatic man, a very intelligent man, in many ways a kindly grandfather type. His men thought he was a man of great honor and personal integrity. And I don't, to a great extent, doubt that. He did seem to be that. However, he tended to waffle. He would say one thing in a letter and then several paragraphs later say another. So
he was a bumbler.
A warning might go out, and in the next paragraph he would draw it back. He was also administering a department that had within it some very forceful personalities, in particular his chief of war plans, Admiral Turner, who really was allowed to have too much influence over what information was sent to the fleet during 1941, and very much constrained what information flowed from Washington out to the commanders in the field. And that bottleneck, if you will, had a real influence on the intelligence that they had in the Pacific versus the intelligence they had at home.
To get to the nub of that, there was a wealth of intelligence that was received in Washington at naval headquarters that never got to Kimmel, that went nowhere in some cases. We report on documents that were never unearthed until now. A naval chart showing that 10 months before the Japanese attack, U.S. naval intelligence had detailed evidence showing that aerial torpedoes could be successfully launched in water as shallow as that of Pearl Harbor. This was vital information to the men at the sharp end in the Pacific, because Pearl Harbor was extremely shallow. But a chart showing how the British had succeeded with aerial torpedoes in the same way that, as we now know, the Japanese were going to, seems to have lain ignored, never passed on to Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii. And just as pertinently, they had intercepted messages sent to the Japanese spy based at the consulate in Hawaii early on in September, 3 or 4 months before the attack, asking him to send detailed information on which ships were in which parts of Pearl Harbor. It's normal for navies to gather intelligence on a potential enemy's harbors, but it is not normal to say where exactly is which battleship and where exactly is such and such an aircraft carrier in a harbor, and what are their movements, what are their routines, when do they come and go. that sort of information is a strong pointer, especially if it's not being asked about other harbors, is a strong pointer to the notion that the potential enemy is planning an attack. There was such information. It built up over the weeks. There came a time when instead of having such reports once a week, the Japanese wanted reports on Pearl Harbor twice a week. This was key information that Admiral Kimmel should have been told, but it wasn't shared with him.
And what did General Marshall know?
Well, General Marshall, like everyone in Washington, was a recipient of the material known as MAGIC. MAGIC was the super-secret code-breaking plan under which the U.S. had been able to break into the Japanese diplomatic codes, particularly a high-level diplomatic code called Purple. And Purple was the code being used to transmit information between Tokyo and the ambassador in Washington who was doing the peace negotiations. Now, everyone in Washington who was receiving that information, and it was a very small group of about 10 officers authorized to receive that, was seeing essentially what the Japanese intended to do diplomatically almost before the Japanese themselves. Now, Admiral Kimmel had no access to that. That said, this intelligence did not contain the plans for the attack on Pearl Harbor. But amongst the intelligence that the MAGIC program gleaned, there were tidbits that did give a clue, such as the request to the spy in Tokyo for the grid layout and the position of ships in harbor. There were those kind of teasers. Unfortunately, that MAGIC program was being very poorly handled. Not only were there only 10 men seeing the material, but those 10 men, because of the need for secrecy, they were seeing individual decryptions of messages one at a time. They were then taken away. They couldn't make notes. The information was burned. They weren't allowed to talk about it. So you had a situation where you were getting all this wonderful data, but you were seeing it only one sliver at a time. As one analyst later described it, they were looking at the individual pictures, but nobody was putting together the movie. And so all that wonderful intelligence was in many ways squandered before Pearl Harbor. And General Marshall was one of those who was seeing that and not seeing it, if you will. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, Marshall, like other senior officials who saw that, bears responsibility. Now, one has to...
As chief of staff.
Exactly. On all of these questions, men lower down the chain of command also bear responsibility for not doing or not seeing. But, in the military, this idea that the man in charge should be held to account should have applied not just to Admiral Kimmel and to Admiral Short and to General Short, but to the men in Washington as well, to General Marshall and to Admiral Stark. And they were not really held accountable for the missteps made in Washington.
We haven't really touched quite in what we've said so far on the ludicrous things this led to. At one point, they were so concerned with secrecy that the information, as Robbyn has said, became effectively useless. But there were ludicrous situations. The president, one might say, of course, was one of the people one of the few people permitted to read MAGIC. But because one of his aides had at some point received a MAGIC report of a decoded message, and it was found screwed up and thrown away in a trash basket at the White House. For a time, the White House was completely cut off from the information, and an officer would go along and read the text of the message in front of the president and not let him keep anything, and require him just to remember it and then leave. And in the end, in the last weeks, President Roosevelt, who realized rather belatedly that this was a ridiculous situation, demanded that he get brought the text of these things again. But it was a silly situation that continued week after week.
I think, Jeff, Kimmel and Short in Hawaii were accused of having been essentially asleep at the switch. That there was a famous book, At Dawn We Slept. Well, it wasn't in Hawaii that people were asleep. In the months before the attack, in the final month, the people reading magic saw a series of messages saying, we must solve this problem. There must be a peace negotiation that is concluded by a deadline. The deadline is November the 25th. Oh, we will give you 4 more days. The deadline is November the 29th. After that, it will be too late. Things will have been put in motion that it will be too late to stop. But no one reading those messages thought, what has been put in motion? What are the Japanese doing that it will be too late to stop? In the final day before the attack, there were a series of messages. We are going to send you our final response to the Americans' latest peace proposal. The final proposal starts coming in. The final answer starts coming in. But the men in Washington act as if it's just another Saturday. People go home. They go to dinner. They go horseback riding. They go to bed. And the messages come in overnight, and there's no one there immediately to translate them and pass them on. So the final message saying, you must deliver our final response to the Americans on these peace negotiations. It must be delivered at specifically this time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. A message which everyone who sees the message agrees means there's something's going to happen at that time. What is 1 p.m.? What does it mean elsewhere in the world? My God, that's 7 a.m. in the Pacific. But no one is there immediately to handle that message because people are home in bed. Now, how can you blame Kimmel and Short for being asleep at the switch when those in Washington are just as asleep and they've got so much more information to go on? And so that crucial bit of information, when General Marshall finally sees it at 11 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, and writes a warning message, it's only minutes before the attack begins, and the warning message he sends gets held up and is finally delivered to Pearl Harbor hours after the attack, when the men are lying dead and Kimmel and Short are licking their wounds and trying to pull things together.
Had Washington been more responsive within the time frame that we're talking about, what might have been different? What might have been done differently that could have forestalled the attack?
Well, in the context of what Robbyn was talking about, that they lost virtually all the night hours of December the 6th, going into December the 7th. And then all the morning hours while they discussed whether to send a warning message to the Pacific or not. If that message had been clear and had been transmitted to Kimmel and Short at the time it could have been transmitted, which would be very early in their morning during their night. During the late night hours, the reaction would have been that all the anti-aircraft gunners would have been ready to fire. They did fire. The Navy guns did fire at the Japanese planes surprisingly quickly, so quickly that the Japanese commander afterwards said that the shock of surprise was almost negated by the swiftness, the efficiency of the naval response. But planes, the Army would have dispersed its planes, reconnaissance planes would have been sent out. So many things that the Army or the Navy could jump to and realize that something was likely to come, possibly going to come. The response would have been much better, much faster. As it was, they got the message from Washington, in the case of Kimmel, 8 hours after the attack began. This is very largely, although there are some sinister things that we found out while we were working on this case, this is very largely a prime example not of the conspiracy theory of history, but the screw-up theory of history. I mean, two things are happening. Tomorrow, they will be unveiling a statue in this town with solemn ceremony. I mean, guns fired, choirs. It's where Admiral Kimmel grew up, and he's never been remembered. And it's going to be and we think a very good statue, actually, one that actually looks like him, inaugurated to him. And the grandsons will be here, who are continuing the fight to get Kimmel's 4-star rank restored, which I think you know if you've looked at the end of the book. The last chapter is really the key to this area. That Congress in the year 2000 sent to then President Clinton a recommendation that Kimmel be posthumously restored to his 4-star rank, and that General Short, the Army commander, also be posthumously restored to the rank he held back then, the top rank he held back then. But no president has acted on it. And at the unveiling of the statue tomorrow, the two grandsons, who have been continuing the fight as their fathers did before them, will be publishing the letter that they've written to President Obama, asking Obama to act on the congressional request to restore their rank before he leaves office.
What is your sense, I mean, given how you've been following this for so long, what is your sense of how this is going to play out?
Well, who knows in the present interregnum between Obama and Trump. On the other hand, presidents, I mean, this is not a question of pardoning these men, but as you know, in their last days in office, it's traditional for presidents to take certain actions to clear people or to things that they decide in their grace and favor they will do. And one thing that would be very easy to do, certainly on paper, very easy to do because both houses of Congress have voted for it, is to restore Kimmel posthumously to his 4-star rank, which is what the family has been pressing for certainly since the Admiral's own death in 1968. Mm-hmm. This has been, there's been huge pressure for this. 36, am I right, Robbyn? 36 admirals of similar rank to Kimmel's or senior have themselves petitioned the president, the past president, George H.W. Bush, for restoration of Kimmel's rank. This has been going on certainly since the 90s.
There is the counter, which is the fact that to apportion blame fairly on the Pearl Harbor case means not that you have to actually point a finger of criticism at General Marshall, who no greater hero has this country, almost, and Harold Stark, who was the architect of the D-Day invasion. He was instrumental in that, and has many, many loyal friends in the Navy. By which I do not mean anything negative. I simply mean that there are good men on both sides of this, and to share out the blame for Pearl Harbor fairly, they must shoulder some of the burden. Mm-hmm. And I think there is resistance to that, to the restoration of the ranks of Kimmel and Short, simply because, in turn, people feel it means leveling that criticism at Marshall, Stark, Turner in particular, and others, and that's it's true. It's tragic. It does not in any way, I think, undermine what those men later did, or their contributions to the later war effort. But at least they were allowed to make those contributions, and Kimmel and Short were denied the opportunity to make further contributions to the war effort, which most agreed they could have made.
I would differ a bit there. Well, we can't have a great debate on it now, but I would differ with Robbyn. I think, yes, of course, and certainly years ago, people would say, well, this would besmirch Chief of Staff Marshall and Admiral Stark, who went on, in spite of his bumbling at the time of Pearl Harbor, went on to distinguish himself as being in charge of the U.S. Navy part in D-Day in Europe and so on. But they're long gone. This is not, I don't think there's any need to go to be attacking Chief of Staff Marshal or dragging Stark's name through the mud. It is a matter of, Joe Biden, the present vice president, if you look on the last page or so of the coda at the end of the book, has called this the most tragic injustice in American military history. And it's a question of righting that wrong. You can right the wrong done to Kimmel and Short without necessarily blasting away at the top brass in Washington who should have shared the blame.
Anthony Summers, Robbyn Swan. The book is A Matter of Honor, Pearl Harbor, Betrayal, Blame, and a Family's Quest for Justice. I thank you both so much for spending time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.